again. My name is Dwayne Neufeld. I'd like to welcome you to the HIMSS Washington Virtual Summit. This is our second session. We have one more this week on Thursday, and then three more next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all of those going from 1 to 2 p.m. You can read more about the upcoming ones on our website. For those that are unfamiliar with HIMSS Washington, this is a volunteer chapter of the HIMSS National Organization. So our board is all volunteers made up of provider members from provider organizations as well as vendors. And as a volunteer organization, we rely very much on our sponsors and our membership for topics and for the funding that allows us to put on these type of presentations. I'm very excited about the presentation we have today with Paul Keckley. He's the principal of the Keckley Report. And this is brought to us by Lumeris. And we're very happy to have with me on this call, John Fryer. I'm going to turn it over to John Fryer, who will introduce Paul, and we will begin the session.
Thanks, Dwayne. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining today's session. I'm John Fryer, Senior Vice President, Head of Market at Lumeris, a value-based care operator enabled by our best-in-class technology platform. We're very excited to be sponsoring this year's virtual summit, and I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce today's keynote speaker and renowned healthcare policy expert, Paul Keckley. Having the pleasure of knowing Paul for a number of years, I'm certain that his deep background and network within the Washington, D.C. Beltway is sure to provide everyone attending today's event a perspective on where health policy is headed, especially in light of yesterday's election and the ongoing electoral process. Paul currently serves as the managing editor of the Keckley Report, a weekly blog covering healthcare industry trends and key issues. He has authored more than 3 books and 200 articles and served as a senior executive at multiple healthcare organizations, including Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Paul is a regular contributor to multiple news outlets, and I'm certain he will provide a lively conversation today on the future of our cherished healthcare system. Without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, John. Dwayne, thank you very much. Yeah, I think everybody in DC is a little sleep deprived, walking around like zombies from the events of the past 36 hours. So we'll put a little context around what to expect and try to frame this in the broader context of the world that health information technology professionals live in. And I'm a little intimidated by this whole concept of me addressing HIT, since my son, who's a resident of Redmond, Washington, and works at Microsoft, routinely consults me about booting up my computer and all of the dumb things I'm inclined to do. So Dwayne, you're my son, you got the best tech head in my family living among you. Let me just kind of back up and frame kind of a thought process around where HIT is headed in healthcare. And I've tried to be very reflective about what this really means. What you do, not just from an organizational standpoint, but from a career development standpoint. So to begin, if you just kind of move this slide here, and by the way, I hate death by PowerPoint, and I'm getting very accustomed to Zoom and looking at the chat feature. So please send some thoughts our way. This is, John Fryer and I compare notes about markets a fair amount. And what seems to be a common thread running across the 384 US markets is that there's a level of demand that's recovering. The second surge that we're experiencing right now will depress some of that, quote, non-essential back on the radar, but there will be a lingering depression of demand for the traditional health system as a result of the COVID and the result of clever, innovative, technology-enabled substitutes for the way we traditionally received care. But nonetheless, demand is recovering some. Trust is reasonably high in the system, but not as high as it was 3 years ago. And if you take a long view, trust in the health system in the aggregate, meaning the gestalt, the way the system operates, has eroded over a 15-year period. And as a result of the pandemic, it's likely it will continue to erode. So it's a good news, bad news scenario. It's kind of like most people think their congressperson is okay, but they think Congress sucks. Well, the health system has a reputation now for being complicated and expensive and wasteful, but it's better than perhaps a government-run alternative. The third kind of level set here is that the finances in the system are eroding across the board. There are just some few exceptions to that. The federal deficit has now gotten to almost $27 trillion. And as of last week, our GDP was at 18 plus 6 trillion. In other words, we're leveraged pretty significantly as a country. If this was a company, we'd say, well, we'd be able to grow our way out of it. But the way the government operates with its monies, it's not as easy to grow out of it, especially since the way we collect revenues for the government varies so widely and disproportionately in certain sectors. So the finances of the system that are largely dependent on public funding, Medicare, Medicaid, taxes, have been eroding for some time, and they continue to erode. And then finally, and this is that slither of unique good news, all of the above has put private investors and private equity in an unusually strong position to make deals. And we're seeing that. Dating back to 2017, when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, the monies that companies saved on their corporate taxes has been significantly invested in private equity, strategic partnerships, and stock buybacks. And that money is in the system. A lot of that money is funding a lot of the private equity plays. So the things on the right there, I think, don't require any comment. The fact is, we don't know when we're going to be beyond COVID. We have 8 manufacturers of vaccines in a race called Warp Speed. We have 3 that are in late stage. We have at least 2 of those that could potentially have a drug ready for emergency use authorization, EUA, by end of this month or early December. But that doesn't mean it's available for the masses. That first tranche of vaccines would be for very, very, very vulnerable populations and healthcare workers. And it's not likely that doses in the hundreds of millions would be available until mid-year next year. And remember that storage of these vaccines and the transmission from port of entry to place of distribution require, in some cases, extreme, significant low temperatures to store this vaccine safely. So there's a lot of things between getting a vaccine approved for EUA and making it available to the masses. So the best guess is probably by 2Q of next year, we're beginning to normalize access to a vaccine. And at that point, in all likelihood, we've probably experienced 400,000 plus deaths in the US. and in certain parts of the country, in the second spike, we've seen another run on our intensive care units, our respirators, and so on. We had some folks in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan just today kind of sound the alarm. So it's geographic, it's growing, but let's assume that we're not going to be past this until next year. And the purpose for our discussion then today is, what do I do in the job I'm in to kind of watch this marketplace and alert the powers that be in the organization and alert my team to things that we can influence and in many ways shape for that organization. Dwayne, if you go to this next slide. This is, for me, the conundrum. And it's the conundrum for HIT as well. We don't operate a healthcare system. What we operate is a collection of independent sectors, each of which has its own technology, its own vernacular, its own rules of engagement, its own sources of capital. And the system has evolved. Dwayne, I noticed this slide's not loading. There you go. What's really happened, and in some ways HIT has been a collaborator in this. This system has grown, and each sector has grown because it can. Essentially, what healthcare is a B2B system, a B2B economic system, in which everybody in the system essentially marks up and passes through their goods, their services to someone else who marks it up and passes it through. And then we essentially spend more than we take in, but the mechanisms for payment in this system allow it. So in its simplest, medical inflation runs about 3% per year. So that's the widgets, the technologies, the beds, even the net aggregated drug expense. But then our labor cost, add another layer, and our administrative cost, add another layer, and all of that ends up resulting in about a 5.5% per year increase of healthcare spending. And about 15% of that comes out of the consumer's pocket through out-of-pocket payments for some things and not for others. But at the end of the day, 85% of the spend is kind of embedded in this B2B model. And what HIT will be doing is not just being the connector and not just the engine that keeps us honest, but it will also be the bridge as the health system moves more of its transactions and more of its funding from this B2B world that it's lived in for 70 years to more and more B2C related products and services. So I'll unpack that a little bit. So Dwayne, go to this next slide. I try to understand how the healthcare system is going to change through the lens of 5 different zones of stuff that goes on. And what I find fascinating about this is that the pace of change in each zone is its own. They're not dependent on changes in the other zones. And the combination of that and the fact that in the healthcare system, each of these sectors has its own technologies, has its own connectivity rules and regs, it makes it unusually difficult for policymakers or investors to determine long-term where to make bets. It's much easier in healthcare to make short-term bets to create profit or create long-term value. It's much easier to think in the near term than the long term. And that's been one of the, I think, hits on the system from those that think we need to start over. So I'm going to unpack these 5 zones. And what I've been thinking about is, what does it mean if I am the CIO, the CMIO, I'm advising folks that operate in these various sectors? What's this mean for me as I advise in these areas? So jump, Dwayne, to the clinical zone. Here's the point I want to make. Everything about healthcare is a derivative of how we diagnose and treat. However, how we diagnose and treat is substantially different than the way we actually do it. Most of the way in the US system we develop differential diagnoses and treatment plans is through a rearview mirror. We take great pride in our randomized control trials and our peer-reviewed study, but what we know is that much, if not most, of what we do lacks evidence. And ironically, the stronger our analytic tools, the more we have the ability to extract data from the system and meta tag this data and create algorithms and even AI-driven prompts and alerts and reminders, the more it exposes the gap between what we do and what the evidence says works best. That's a pretty difficult assessment. It basically says the more we know, the less we know. So what will clinical IT lead us to? And how do you pay for it? And do organizations recognize that the driver for the organization's future will be based on its ability to assemble this clinical data and relate this clinical data to administrative, operational, and financial information beyond what's in a medical record or what's in a health insurer's claims record to bring insight to decisions? That's a pretty heady responsibility. And my experience through the years has been HIT is always fighting for the next incremental solution and rarely has the time to think forward 5, 10 years to the way clinical data abstraction from a wider host of sources, not just allopathic medicine. We in the US teach an allopathic Western medicine view of healthcare. Asian and Ayurvedic systems are quite different. And it's become very clear that a lot of what we do would benefit from non-allopathic, some call it alternative health. And the fact is that's true. So that's challenge 1. How does HIT going forward have a seat at the table, not just around the notion of digital connectivity and capturing data in point solutions and open platform and interoperability, to a longer term seat at the strategy table around the future of how care is delivered and the kinds of data necessary to navigate that. So that's just point one. The second, if you move, Dwayne, and this one is the first cousin to clinical innovation. What's been ironic about healthcare is we're an industry where the use of technology has, for the most part, not been a net reduction of cost. It hasn't reduced cost across the board. Now that's a pretty strong indictment, but the data from the Bureau of Labor and Department of Commerce and a number of other analytic deep dives in this show that points to two things. The reason in healthcare that our technologies, whether they're clinical, they're diagnostics like advanced MRI or this or that, or they're administrative, the reason is that our workforce does not adapt to technology easily. In fact, most of the assessments of our workforce show it to be one of the least productive workforces compared to other industries. And they often compare us to banking and financial services and show us at the bottom of the scale, comparing about 20 industries, and finance at near top, where now it is standard that solutions don't involve a human touch at all. So that's part A, that people in our industry don't adapt technology well. So we may select a platform that solves this problem in the organization for the organization, but it'll be the people side of that that determines whether the value is created. And the second reason from an economist standpoint is spending in healthcare is additive. It is B2B. There are a few constraints on spending. So we can always add technology without replacing something. And that's the softness of the healthcare economy. So the question here, and the technology and the clinical innovation kind of go hand in glove. What would be the roadmap to HIT investments that will deliver long-term value, not just the point solution for, I remember when I was at Vanderbilt, we were constantly looking for the point solution to solve this immediate problem. And the longer term question of where should we be in 5 and 10 years, that was not a discussion that was well informed. And a lot of that had to do with how much energy was soaked up in taking care of tomorrow morning's problem. So technology and clinical innovation become a focus for HIT professional input, and I would submit leadership. We have to take that role. But one of the things I think's a real positive that's come out of the past decade is the role of CMIO, the Chief Medical Informatics Officer, because that's that intersection of data, IT, and clinical. But the third for me is the fun zone. And I'm in DC, and I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that my prediction is that at the end of the day, Vice President Biden will end up winning this by a hair. And the Senate will stay in Republican control. But that's not the story here. The story is, how does the healthcare system operate going forward in the context of a country that's overly indebted, that's divided, and has strong opinions about the healthcare system, but lacks a lot of information about the system. Most of the studies show that voters regard healthcare based on their own experiences as a patient or a member of a family that had a problem with the system. We don't have a system view of healthcare. Systemness in healthcare is not the basis for the policy around healthcare in the US, which ironically has contributed to the underinvestment in its HIT. When in 2009, the Reconstruction Act provided some initial funds to advance meaningful use, to its credit, both sides of the aisle said, you know, healthcare has got to catch up to the rest of the economy in its use of data and HIT. And without exception, since 2009, the funds for HIT at a federal level have been pretty untouched. Now, that doesn't mean that things have gone smoothly. Politics trumps policy. And the premise that we're in an industry with highly sensitive information and an industry that's not friendly toward consumers lends itself to policies like the information sharing rule that's out last week. It lends itself to a lot of flag waving around hacking and ransomware and exposing patient records to devious users. So the policy world looks at healthcare as a big, cumbersome collection of high-cost activities that operates as a quasi-regulated set of organizations. And a second thought is, so somewhere in those organizations, there are people that make sure data is protected and systems are in place. But there's no codification of that about what would be the right investment and the right focus if the long ball was systems of health. And that system of health allowed every individual and every caregiver to contribute to and extract data from a system to make better judgments about their health. That's the long ball. Investors will continue to make near-term investments to generate return to their shareholders in sectors where markets allow. There is a disconnect, a growing disconnect between private equity investing and the public good. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean that from a practical sense. If an investor's return for acquiring and rolling up a number of dermatology practices or whatever is to generate a 20% CAGR for their partners and take a 2% management fee and then flip that to another fund in 5 years, then are the community's interests served? And are those funds in certain communities better spent? So we're going to have a growing tension between the role of investors, private investors in healthcare, and the public system, and you're going to see that play out over the next 2 or 3 years. And regrettably, HIT will have to voice its view of the best and highest use of data, technology, and information-driven healthcare in its future. The fourth zone is the capital market, which is, again, akin to this policy domain we just talked about. Private equity has, and private investment in healthcare is growing at an astronomical rate because it can. Now, what's changed really since 2016, 17, and 18, and the past 24 months, is that there are fewer deals being done with private money, but they're bigger deals. There's more money available in venture-backed startups, many of which are IT solutions, but much more venture money available for follow-on offerings in the current portfolio than startups. So the capital markets are viewing this system relative to HIT as a market where we need to mature the investments we've made, and where data and technology that take cost out and take it out dramatically are the highest order investment that can be made. So regretfully, technologies that exist to improve quality, where quality is not directly related to a reduced cost, probably take a second seat to others. And then lastly, the consumer view in healthcare is misunderstood. Consumerism in healthcare is not simply the amount of money that a consumer spends for a product or a service. I was in a discussion earlier today around some of the OTC stuff, but it has to do with the role it plays in influencing the behavior of people inside the system. And you see that list there in white of the types of metrics that are increasingly important to defining the scale and scope of consumerism in healthcare. Most providers are more comfortable thinking about patients, not consumers. But the game changer here is that increasingly more of the cost of health is borne by end users, individuals, families. So to the extent that HIT becomes the bridge between a healthcare organization and individuals and consumers, is one of those big, hairy, audacious, likely roles that you're going to play in your organization. I don't think that's about point solutions. I think it's not inconsequential that groups like Amazon are thinking broadly that if we can own direct to consumer in healthcare for a substantial number of purchases made, we can control downstream the other services in the system. In other words, is there a point at which most of the healthcare market is a B2C industry in which conventional hospitals are commoditized, where unnecessary demand has been shrunk out of that system by consumers empowered with the data at the point of their decision? And that's going to be a sector by sector decision. So that's, you look at all five of these, this is kind of a moonshot. This is saying the role of the HIT professional is wide, and it's deep, and it's strategic, and it's expensive. It's a major investment, and it's not an afterthought because we understand we have to achieve meaningful use and interoperability. It's something more than that. So the last thing I wanted to show you, I've been trying to step back I spend several hours every day reading proposed rules and reading campaign platforms and trying to understand where the system's going. And candidly, it seems to me we're at an inflection point. About half our population looks at the healthcare system and says, I give it a C minus. It's not working well for me for a variety of reasons. And about a third of the population says, I want to protect the system, but it sure could improve. And we only have 1 in 5 in our population who tend to like the system as it is. And ironically, they tend to be seniors and they tend to be in military health. And they tend to be healthy seniors, not just all seniors. And those in military health are those on active duty that pay nothing out of pocket and like that system. But once leaving that system and become part of the VA, then they become either one of the 9 million veterans that use the VA system or the 14 million that don't use it at all. So we've got fewer and fewer people who are looking at the healthcare system and saying, the way it's operated in the past is the way I'd like to see it operate in the future. Now, November 10th, we'll have arguments in the Supreme Court around the Affordable Care Act. And we'll hear the ruling from this court sometime in 2021. They have to actually report their rulings before the session adjourns, which is June 30, 2021. My suspicion is this court will say the Affordable Care Act can stand, even though the individual mandate is severable from that law. In other words, the ACA is likely to be for quite some time the framework for thinking about the future of the healthcare system. And what the ACA does, whether this is a Trump or a Biden administration, what it basically did is it said we need to expand access through Medicaid expansion and marketplaces and this and that. But in tandem, we've got to shift all the incentives of the system from fee-for-service to value. Now, John and I have had this discussion many times. Value is an abstract concept in healthcare. But over the next 3 years, regardless of who wins this contested race, value will become concrete in the US system. Here's the reason. We cannot afford the status quo. The mounting federal deficit and a forecast that healthcare spending will increase at 5.4% per year through 2028. That's the official OIG forecast. Says we cannot sustain the health system as it is. So from a practical standpoint, for me, that means that HIT is going to be at the table pounding its fist saying, if you make $1 investment in me, I can take $1.50 of cost out in 3 years. And respectfully, HIT has been fighting this fight for 15 years, and it's not done it well. We need to be more discreet about where we make those statements, and we need to be more definitive in proving the ROI. And it can no longer be rationalized as it's simply a way of connecting things, but we do business the way we always did. Workflows, the way we procure, and the way we diagnose and treat will be HIT-enabled new processes. So for all of you on this call, I think that's great. I think that's awesome. We can no longer operate through the rearview mirror, and that's where I think you're going to play a key role. So I'm going to stop. What I want to do is just kind of open it up and see kind of where your heads are. I'm looking at the chat room. Let's see. Ken, thank you for that note. I was at Deloitte for a while. I was in DC. Do we have any questions, guys? Oh, I got this value-based trajectory. In the Affordable Care Act, there are 7 major categories of value-based payments. And there are 54 models, alternative payment models, that CMS has authorized since 2013. For the most part, the alternative payment models have underperformed if their purpose was to save Medicare money. In some cases, especially physician organizations that are well organized, they've been able to achieve some pretty dramatic savings. But there has to be kind of this unique cocktail of it's the right market, it's a very strong primary care centric medical group, and utilization in the market was reasonably high. So by reducing unnecessary utilization, you had arbitrage. So I think that's something to kind of pay attention to, but I think value definition and then value achievement is something every organization will have to, fight hard to get. Jeff Clark asked this question: how likely are we to see the public option? Jeff, I don't think you'll see it as quickly as the campaign, the Biden campaign argued. You're more likely to see Medicare expanded to those 60 years of age and older, because that's less a debate. The reason the public option is going to be a challenge is the cost. To subsidize people to get their insurance on the public option. So follow me on this. The public option becomes a vehicle for people whose insurance with their employer costs more than 8.5% of their adjusted gross income. In other words, anybody whose insurance isn't affordable and you make up to 400% of the federal poverty level or above, you can go to the public option. But when you go to the public option, it's subsidized. Your premium is subsidized. That means more deficit spending. So if the Senate is a Republican-controlled Senate, I don't think you're going to see a warming to additional deficit spending for the public option, as opposed to the plan around Medicare, which is Medicare enrollees are basically paying the premium. So it's a different scenario. I think you'll hear the public option revisited in 2022, but I don't think you'll see it implemented right away. This is from Ken. Do you see home health emergency access to telehealth passing? I think there are some issues with that, none the least of which is parity. Do we pay at parity with physical visits? And that's a hot debate. Do I think there's going to be some legislation? Yeah, but I think the devil in this one is the detail. Telehealth's big challenge is, how do you compare it to a physical visit in terms of third-party reimbursement? And then once you get past that hurdle, it's the coding and the verification and all of the others. So that's a HIT nightmare. This is from John. Do you have any thoughts on how the process of moving from loose confederation of sectors to a system will play out? Here's a pretty interesting statistic. 55 systems right now. John, I don't see the rest of your last name. Norin Bin, is that right? Is that it? Is that close?
John Nornberg from
Nuremberg. Hey, John. Well, 55 systems are 27% of the delivery system today. And I'm not talking about where you claim it as an Ascension or an HCA. I'm talking about regional hubs that control visits, primary care, procedures, in and outpatient admissions and utilization. We've got 55 of these systems that are right now 27% of the entire system. So I think we will have a new legislative framework that defines competition across systems in regions rather than local markets. And as a result, we'll have a race to just think of a place like Texas. Does Baylor Scott and White and THR and perhaps Memorial Hermann, do there end up being 3 to 5 systems of health in the state of Texas? I could see that possibility. And I think that's the way we're headed. What's unlikely is that the health insurers are going to be happy about it. The tension right now is insurers have convinced Congress, and the data supports them. I should say that quickly. Combinations of hospitals reduces cost short term 4 to 7%, but increases cost long term substantially more than that. So the plans have done a good job of saying the reason hospitals come together is not to save. They come together to get leverage on us. So the primary driver of Systemness is more likely to be large self-insured employers who can contract with these systems for a wider range of services beyond a 1-year agreement. Think of a 3-year fully capitated agreement with a system. That will likely drive this faster than what the insurance folks are doing. And there'll be exceptions to that.
Paul, I've got a question from Jessica. What is the outlook for continued GPO utilization?
Oh boy, great question. You know, the traditional GPOs, like Premier and others, probably have outlived their usefulness. And I don't mean that they have no future. It means that most of them are diversifying. Premier obviously became a public company and does a lot of consulting and performance improvement work and things like that. So I think the conventional GPO is probably an endangered species. It'll continue to have a life, but it'll have a narrower life. There are folks like Chuck Grassley in Iowa, the senator, who've always had a bee in their bonnet around GPOs are essentially cartels. So I don't see anything on the radar that says long term they can be as significant as they were 10 years ago. Just don't see it. And by the way, some of the bigger manufacturers are kind of quietly saying, we see that, we're there. We don't mind going direct to our bigger customers. If you end up with 55 systems that are 27% of the delivery system, why do I need a GPO? Why don't I go direct? So I think that's an interesting dynamic. Good question.
So Paul, are there some things that you're looking at right now over the next month or two that are going to be pivotal in healthcare that we should be watching for?
Yeah. I'm watching carefully the budget process. The states, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budgets. And each state allocates monies to its Medicaid programs and its state employees differently, but in some states it's as much as 40% of a state's budget. So I'm watching where the state Medicaid directors double down on managed Medicaid. As all of you know, in 39 states, the Medicaid program is essentially subcontracted to a private managed care organization. So names like Centene and Molina and folks like that. But there really hasn't been the kind of oversight of the care provided through these MCO agreements. It's been more a way for state legislators to say, I've subcontracted this to the MCO, so every time their contract comes up for renewal, I'll look at it. I don't think it's solving the Medicaid population issue. It's a very diverse population, and it is a transient. Many are transient in that population. So I'm watching states, short answer, because I think they're against the wall on Medicaid. I'm going to watch how they react to the ransomware that seems to be spiking around the country. That's getting a lot more attention at the federal level. And I'm very interested in how a Joe Biden will address, in his platform, he has taken a position against hospital consolidation. So I'll be interested, if he is the president, what directive he gives to his Department of Justice and his FTC, and whether they say we're going to review all of those recent consolidations and the ones that are pending. I think I just saw one where Intermountain is going to merge with Samford. I'll be watching that. That's probably at the top of my list. There's always something.
Thank you. We've got another question from Joseph, adding to the discussion on the GPO. If GPO expands services and other LOB, is that what you see as a stabilizing factor for larger, more diverse GPOs?
Possibly. I'm an old geezer, and I remember when the GPO was essentially, we were purchasing disposables, and we'd get preferred contracts on certain technologies and gadgets and things. It's extended much beyond that now. So yeah, I think the lines of business that the GPO of the future provides will be broad. And the good thing, I think what GPOs have in some cases is a pretty good line of sight to the needs of organizations below the C-suite. There are a lot of folks that have primarily interacted with either the CMIO, the CIO, or the people in the C-suite, but that frontline procurement engine in an organization, which is rich with data, is not one that's gotten the attention that I think some of these GPOs with expanded lines of business will have. So I like it. I think it's going to be good. If I were, as an investor, I'd probably make investments in that space.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think we can take maybe one more question if somebody has a question they'd like to pose.
Let me kind of wrap it up with a couple of things, because I literally, I guess I'm intimidated by the role you play and always feeling totally unequipped to interact intelligently with people that do what you do. I feel really good about where HIT has landed in the scheme of healthcare's future. And I mean that genuinely. I think there's recognition that we have been absent the kind of investment and understanding of HIT that was necessary. And I think there's a lot of catch up. I don't in the board meetings I'm in, I don't hear as much pushback as I did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. That said, there's not any clarity about the long view, about where we make the big bets, much beyond ERPs and the discussion of Epic or Cerner or Meditech or whatever. We're not leading people to the discussion of an information-driven healthcare system. And that's not going to be solved by Epic or Cerner or Meditech. It's going to be solved by the people that sit in those meetings and say, here's where we need to be thinking, whether it's in this clinical or whatever. And that's what I would encourage. I think we can't let our solution be the answer to the long view. I think it has to be the intellect and energy of the people on this call. So bum me a note if you run across something that looks a little weird and crazy. And I really do appreciate your time today, folks. And I appreciate Lumeris supporting this effort. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for attending today. Paul, that was an amazing amount of information. I promised everybody would have some golden nuggets to take back to the water cooler, and I think you delivered more than enough of that. Thank you again. I wanted to let you know that the virtual summit continues tomorrow. We've got a great session on remote work, the remote workers. Robert Pagler and Scott Waters, two of our CIOs from the advisory group, are going to be leading a discussion in this area, and then they will be joined with a group of additional CIOs. We have people from Providence, Seattle Children's, as well as Peace Health joining the discussion. It should be a really robust hour. I'm looking forward to that, and then we'll start back up next week. But again, thank you for being here. Paul, thank you for all that you presented and all that you're doing behind the scenes to keep this moving forward.
Thank you.